Hello, and thanks for joining us today for our online service at Willowdale Chapel. My name is Jim, and I'm one of the associate pastors here, as well as the pastor of our Celebrate Recovery community. And we're continuing in our teaching series titled The Bless. And we are right in the middle of it. We looked at B, at bringing goodness, and L, listening well. And today in Bless is the E. We're going to be looking at eating meals. In the coming weeks, we're going to talk about sharing stories and saying prayers. And I'm excited. I've been excited about this series. I have been enjoying it. Just think about it for a moment with me. Bring goodness, listen well, eat meals, share stories, say prayers. Each and every one of these, in a sense, is ordinary. These are very ordinary behaviors and practices. Checking in on a neighbor, dropping off a meal, listening, eating, talking, praying, right? These are everyday, ordinary behaviors. Like there's nothing here to get wrapped around the axle about or get full of anxiety over. I mean, Romans 12:1, in the style of the Message, says it this way. So here is what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life. You're sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. And in part, it's why I've enjoyed this teaching so much, because oftentimes we think we need to have this giant BHAG. And if you're not familiar with that term, BHAG, this big, hairy, audacious goal. And that, at least for me, can be anxiety producing. We can freeze and end up doing nothing except asking, like, what's my purpose? What's my calling? Like, I'm supposed to have a BHAG. What is it? Now, if God has placed one on your heart, like, that is awesome, great. But more than likely for many of us, our big, hairy, audacious goal is to live an ordinary life in an extraordinary way. Live ordinary lives that with Jesus are extraordinary. This, in a lot of ways, is what we've been talking about in this series. Now, would you just join me for a short prayer? Father, you have placed us right where we are for your use and your purpose. In our waking, in our walking around, in our shopping, in our neighborhood, in ordinary life, in the rhythms of life, you look to use us. So, Father, would you open our eyes and to the work that you are doing in our lives and to what you are calling us to, these rhythms of your goodness and your grace. Father, make us aware of them, I pray. Amen. Now, there is a second reason why I love this teaching as well, and it's really because of my own story and my own journey and what I've learned. And mostly what I've learned in the past 6 years is being part of our Celebrate Recovery community. You know, I've joked with others that when I write my book, that is the joke, when I write my book, it's going to have a title like Sit in Circles or something like that, maybe a little bit more hip or cooler, but Sit in Circles. See, when do we sit in rows? Well, in school for one, right? We sit in rows in school. We've been taught from a very early age that sitting in rows is this posture of learning. It's efficient where one person can address many and transfer ideas and thoughts and knowledge. Or perhaps we sit in rows like consumers at a concert or a show or a movie. We sit in rows as others entertain us. And it makes good sense, doesn't it? Like, it would be hard to get a few hundred people and to kind of circle them up to sit in circles, would it not? Now, some people in our world, they can have a little problem with the way they view religion in this way. Or maybe what I should say is how they view or understand it. Because yes, we sit in rows at times when somebody teaches about a certain behavior or a character trait. And I mean, our faith, it should inform our behavior. But for those who maybe are on the outside of church or just sit on the fringe of church, sitting in rows can often feel a little legalistic and they miss the relationships. Right? There's a way to act and behave, and we need to remember that those actions and behaviors are simply the branches of the tree, right? But the roots, right? They lie beneath the branches. And the roots of the person or the behaviors of others, right? They're usually driven by a need, often an unmet need. And so we live a blessed type life where we get to know others and we get to address the needs of others. It's in times like these, around unmet needs, that we are served well to sit in circles. Right? When we bring goodness to someone else, what do? We come around them, right? Or when we listen well, right? We circle up, we lean in, we live life face to face, honest, transparent with other people in circles. When we eat meals, we gather around a table. When we share stories, we sit around the family room. And when we say prayers, we huddle up. See, we were created to live life and experience life in circles. See, when we sit in rows, information is exchanged. But when we sit in circles, transformation begins. Now, I'm not saying we should stop sitting in rows. We share covenant life together. We share Jesus together, sitting in rows in our worship center. We worship Jesus together in that way. It's a profound and important part of what we do. But take the information that you learn there, and then you go and you sit in circles, and you begin to let that inform you and transform you. Did Jesus have people sit in rows? A posture of learning? Sure he did, right? He taught in the synagogues. Jesus preached. Most of us know about his Sermon on the Mount. He passed on information. He corrected religious leaders. This is row type stuff. Sitting in rows is important. Information, ideas, knowledge is transferred. And Jesus most certainly used this method of teaching. And it is very often how we think about Jesus, isn't it? Right? The Sermon on the Mount, him standing there teaching and preaching the masses. However, I want you to consider three quick passages. Mark 10:45. It says, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom to many." Another "the Son of Man came" text is Luke 19:10. "The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Now, both of these, right? Both of these Son of Man statements, they are about his purpose. They are about his mission. This is what he came to do and accomplish. However, there's one more in Luke 7:34, where it says, "The Son of Man came eating and drinking." This, my friends, is Jesus' strategy to fulfill his purpose and mission. And not only that, but he employs his strategy so well. He eats and drinks so well that his critics accuse him of being a glutton and a drunk. Now, it's not a correct critique, but Jesus was always ready to have a party, always ready to break bread, to share a meal with others. See, we have a need. And Jesus, he comes to seek, to save, to serve. But Jesus first reveals that need by sharing a meal with us. And then he speaks to our need, and he meets us right where we are, right where we need him most, at our unmet need. I want you to think about the famous Bible story where Jesus, he hosts breakfast on the beach for his disciples shortly after his resurrection. Peter has a need, a deep hurt. He is struggling with shame. And so Jesus, he shows up. He starts a fire on the beach, and he begins to cook breakfast. And he calls his disciples. He says, "Gather around. Let's sit around the fire. Let's share life and a meal together." And as they are finishing that meal, Jesus says, "Peter, can we talk about that girl around that other fire that you denied even knowing me to?" And Jesus talks to Peter's need, not his failure, but his need. And Peter finds healing, redemption, and purpose. See, sitting in rows, teaching is good. The transformation of knowledge and information is good. but it's sitting in circles. It's this sharing of life and sharing a meal, being honest and transparent, right? Accepting non-judgmental. Circle sitting is transforming. It's life-changing. And that's why there's almost a meal on every single page in the book of Luke. Like, seriously, there are 50 meals. Jesus is either coming to or going to a meal throughout the book of Luke. And so let's turn to one of those meals now. It's Luke 5, verses 27 through 32. After this, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And leaving everything, he rose and followed him. And Levi made him a great feast in his house. And there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at the table with them. And the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus answered them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. All right, so let's spend a little time unpacking this. Jesus is sharing a meal. He's reclining at a table, this great feast in which he's the guest of honor. And the Pharisees, they have a problem. Now, the Pharisees, they have no problem with the fact that Jesus, who claims to be the Son of God, the Messiah, is at the party. The party is not the problem. Even the Pharisees understand that when God comes back, when he brings his kingdom, there's going to be a great banquet. And so what is the Pharisees' problem? Well, it's the guest list. And it says it in verse 30, right? "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" By the way, it's the Pharisees that label them as sinners, like Luke before this, in the verse before. He just calls them others. Here the Pharisees label them as sinners. And this is just where it's so easy for us to simply pile on and shake our head and wag our fingers at the Pharisees, right? Because they sound so pious and holier than thou and legalistic. They miss the entire fact that there's now this retired tax collector who is giving honor to Jesus. A man who had a life-transforming experience with Jesus now wants all of his other tax-collecting and sinning friends to meet him, to have this same life-transforming experience. And so we just shake our heads at the Pharisees in disappointment once again. But we should slow down for a moment and consider what the Pharisees actually see. They see a shared meal between a Jewish rabbi and sinners. And this was cause for great alarm because shared meals meant shared lives, right? Sharing a meal with the tax collector was sharing a meal with a traitor, with a collaborator. See, the tax collectors, they worked for the enemy. They worked for Rome. The Jewish people were looking for God to return, to defeat Rome, to establish his kingdom. So this goes beyond like Israel versus Rome, but this is Rome versus God. And the tax collectors who were Jewish, oh, well, they sided with Rome, their very oppressor. Sharing a meal with a tax collector was scandalous. And here they were at a party with Jesus. And Jesus is sitting down and sharing a meal with his very enemies. And this was a case of identity. This was a case of purity for the Pharisees. Like, how dare this rabbi eat meals with the enemy? This is the current reality, right, that the Pharisees are dealing with. But it goes beyond that because they know their history. And historically, the Jewish people were unfaithful to God's command not to marry outside the covenant. And that caused great pain, right? They didn't protect the purity, and that was hardship for the nation of Israel. Not the least of which was being exiled by Babylon. So whenever a purity issue was in view, the Pharisees became hyper vigilant. They were intent to never deal with such impurity issues ever again. And so this is how these dietary laws, which really originated and were intended for the priests in the synagogue, ended up being extended to every Jew and to every table. See, the very ethos of the Pharisee was one of striving, working, earning. They believed if everyone could just get it right for just one day, if we could just work hard enough, if we could just be good enough, God would return and establish his kingdom. And so they worked to keep the purity of Israel. And they missed the very act of mercy and grace that was happening right in front of their eyes. The kingdom was already here. As a Jew who now had to abide by this strict spirit of earning God's grace, these dietary laws intended for the priest and the temple now become these boundary markers in culture. They marked out the boundaries of intimacy and acceptance. See, Jewish food laws not only symbolized these cultural boundaries, but then they created more and they extended them more. Meaning it wasn't easy. If you were Jewish, it was not easy for you to break bread and have a meal with a Gentile or an outsider. It was near impossible. What was the meat bled properly? Did it meet all of the standards of being kosher? These restrictions, they created an inability for intimacy and connection towards the Gentile, towards the outsider. And this is really key for us to understand in all of this, because these cultural markers, these boundaries still exist for today. And probably the easiest way to point to it is take a moment and just remember the middle school cafeteria lunch table, right? There were boundaries that were set. Who was in, who was out, who was good enough, who was not good enough. It was clearly established by those who sat at that lunch table. And even in that scene, there was one side of the table that was elevated over the other. So it's not just an issue of ancient times, but it's an issue for us today as well. And here, Jesus, he's trying to give a demonstration, a view of the great banquet that was promised all the way back in Isaiah 25:6. Where it says, on this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food and full of marrow and aged wine well refined. See, the banquet that Jesus is going to host is for all people and for all nations. But for the Pharisees, the Gentiles, the outsiders, the unclean, they just dropped completely off the guest list. The Pharisees, they didn't reject the temple system, but they actually moved it beyond its proper context. They moved the purity laws from the temple and from the priests to every Jew and every table all year long. And then they guarded that table to ensure its purity. The message was clear. You do not belong. You do not fit. You do not make the cut. You sinners do not measure up to the standard of purity expected by the religious leaders. And so a thing as ordinary as sharing a meal becomes complex. And in fact, the table gets closed to others. The Pharisees, they see Jesus eating with sinners, and they're worried about Israel's purity. But Jesus is saying, for him, intimacy with the tax collector and sinner, it doesn't cause impurity for him, but rather it brings purity to the tax collector and the sinner. See, Jesus once again is establishing this surprising upside down nature of his kingdom. And this is where you're sitting there thinking, but Jim, we don't have diet purity laws anymore, so why are you still talking? Well, maybe we don't, but again, it seems like we might have something akin to it. See, the Pharisees were just looking to protect the purity of their community. And the question is, do we subconsciously tend to do the same thing, have the same posture? I've heard this said for years that when somebody becomes a Christ follower, within 3 years, they no longer have any non-believing friends. I think there's enough anecdotal evidence out there to think that maybe that's true. Well, this week while I was preparing, I did some Googling. I wanted to find out if there was any more information on that statement. I came across this one survey, and the survey asked a few short questions of believers. It asked, how many non-Christian friends do you have at work? How many non-Christian friends do you have in your neighborhood? And how many non-Christian friends do you have in other spaces, meaning the gym, the coffee shop, the market? Well, the average for each one, for everyone that took the survey, 2, right? I have 2 non-Christian friends at work. I have 2 that I would call friends in the neighborhood and 2 around town. Which means if Jesus came back and threw a grand banquet for you and for all of your non-believing friends, it would be a grand banquet for 6. And we could take a negative view of that, a half-defeated view, but I don't. I think 6 is actually a great place to start. And how many more do your 6 non-believing friends know? It's a great place to start, but we have to know our own tendency to want to separate from others. There just seems to be this natural dynamic that occurs that we have to be aware of and that we have to be intentional about. You know, I get the privilege of going to Bowling Green every Sunday. If you don't know, Bowling Green is our local chemical dependency rehabilitation center. I get to go every Sunday to host church. And I love that we get to do this. But you know what? If we're honest, we have to do this. We need to, because the clients at Bowling Green would never walk through our doors to worship with us or any church, right? Like, think about it. If you were never invited to sit down and share a sandwich with a Christ follower, to break bread and have a meal with somebody who claimed Jesus to be their Lord, like, would you feel that it would be safe to walk through our doors to come and worship with us? And this is where we need to begin to view meal, eating, as a ministry, right? Meals as ministry. And this is what it's not. It is not some bait and switch marketing. When I was a kid, I remember this strategy. It was, you might remember, I found it for others as old as I. I found it. And probably for some that are hearing this, there's probably an internal groan. For the rest of you, just so you know, I found it was you got a bumper sticker that you put on your car, and it said just that, I found it. And so when people would ask you what you found, you were supposed to say, Jesus, I found Jesus. That was the strategy. You had this nice little gospel track and presentation, and we were going to change the world one stranger at a time standing at the gas pumps because of our bumper stickers that said, I found it. This is not that. Our friends are not our projects. They are friends. And so relax, this is not about tracks. This is not about a doodling on a napkin. We are not trying to be the closer. We are just living life with others. What it is a meal. It's sitting in circles together. It's being seen and seeing others. It's listening and being heard. It's honest, transparent life lived together as we sit face to face in circles around tables. It's a shared meal, meaning a shared life. See, Levi was not a project for Jesus. He was a person that Jesus took genuine interest and curiosity in. He was a friend who, by the way, becomes the disciple Matthew, and then they do life and ministry together for the next 3 years. And here's how it all works together. When we begin to pull all of these aspects, the rhythm of blessed together, we sit in circles, we share meals, we find a way to live ordinary life in extraordinary ways, right? Ordinary things that begin to take on great significance and great purpose. You know, I've been indulging in some content that's called the 7 Primal Questions by Mike Foster. For some of you, you might recognize that name as the author of Rescue Academy. The premise of his work here is that each and every one of us has a driving question. A question above all other questions that we are trying to answer. And more specifically, we are trying to answer with a yes. We see all of life and filter all of life through our one question. It is our unmet need that drives our behaviors. And in his studies, he's narrowed it down to 7 questions. There are 7 common questions. It's, am I safe? Right? That's physical safety. Am I secure? Right? That's about resources. Am I loved? Am I wanted? And just for the record, that's my question, right? We all have one. Having one's not the problem. It's understanding what it is and knowing how it affects us and how do we answer that with a yes. But I look at life through the question of, am I wanted? There's, am I successful? Am I good enough? Do I have purpose? Now, there's a lot more to this, but at the very basic, simplest form, the premise is that by being intentional, by paying attention, we can begin to understand both our question, but also the questions of other people. And we get to answer their soul level question with a yes. Just think about how sitting around the table and sharing a meal might answer a person's question of, am I loved? Am I wanted? Am I good enough? Sitting in circles, seeing people's inherent humanity, it goes a long way into answering a person's soul level driving question. Right? I mean, in a lot of ways, just your presence speaks volumes. Let's link some of what we've learned together, right? A kind gesture, bringing goodness to another that leads to sitting in a circle, face to face. A shared meal is shared life. I listen well, and when I listen well, I kind of pick up on your driving question, right? Because we're all looking to answer it, so it kind of seeps out of us. And now I get to answer your question with a yes. Yes, you are safe. Yes, you are loved. Yes, you are good enough. And next week, we're going to start speaking about sharing stories. So not only do you get to answer your friend's driving soul question with a yes around the table sharing a meal, but then you get to share your story and how God has answered your soul level question with a yes. And all of this, because of intentionality, we choose to live an ordinary life in extraordinary ways. And so here is the challenge for this week. In light of all of this, I want you to do the next right thing. The next right thing is a phrase that you would hear us say a lot around Celebrate Recovery. Just do the next right thing. You don't have to figure it all out today. You don't have to have all the answers today, but you need to be active. You need to do the next right thing. So maybe for you, you've noticed you have run out of non-Christian friends. So what's your plan? How are you going to meet and make new friends? How are you going to grab coffee with a neighbor or a coworker just to get to know them better? Maybe you have some friends that are close to you but far from Jesus. And maybe it's time to get that lunch, get that dinner, get that meal on the calendar. Send the invite, schedule it, start sitting in circles and eating meals together. Maybe you're already having regular meals, but maybe it's time to introduce some deeper conversation. Look, it doesn't have to be like overly churchy, right? Maybe it's just like, hey, I heard this idea of these 7 questions and how one of these will kind of resonate and connect with you. And it's kind of your soul level question. Like, what do you think? Like, which question do you think's yours? Why? Just see where the conversation might take you. By circling up and sharing meals, what we do is we build a framework that holds up to the weight of the conversation and wherever this conversation might take you. And then consider this. Remember that BHAG, that big, hairy, audacious goal? Maybe we do have one after all. I mean, bringing the good news of the gospel to 6 unbelieving friends. And maybe those 6 unbelieving friends, but maybe the person sitting next to you right now, or the person viewing you from another screen, or the person that's hearing this on a Sunday morning. Maybe it's just that in our culture where we've become very individualistic, our BHAG is together, and together we make great impact. And you don't have to feel the weight of it. We are just living ordinary lives in extraordinary ways. There's no pressure to it. As a theologian had once said, God did not create us to bear the weight of outcomes. Just set up the meal. Make the invite. If the opportunity arrives, take the conversation to deeper things, to spiritual things. And if not, just let your presence speak to their soul level question. Right? It's all good. We just get to be obedient and to leave the outcome to God. And so take what you hear today in this posture of sitting in rows, of learning information and new ideas. Take it and put it into practice. Sit in circles with others, sharing meals in a way that you get to have a front row seat to God's transformative work in their lives. And just know by doing it, He will be doing a transformative work in yours. Thanks for being with us. Have a great week.
Thanks for checking out our online teaching. If you enjoyed this content and would like some more information about us, head over to our website at www.willowdalechapel.org or download our app. There you can stay up to date on any events, ministries, and other opportunities we have coming up at Willowdale Chapel.